Hey guys, Rob here, and today you join me for part 2 of how to make wide body flares. Now if you watched part 1, we finished off with shaping all the Tamiya putty and we just want to let that dry for a couple of days. It's actually been a couple of weeks before I could get back to this, so we're going to move forward and I'm going to show you how to shape all this putty today. So first thing you want to do, we're going to remove the cardboard that we applied underneath the model. So that was fitted by putting a couple of drops of super glue on the inside. This will pull out very easily now that the putty has dried rock solid. So you can see there that the putty is pretty much following the shape of the wheel arch, and we're going to use a Dremel to basically grind that out flush with the die cast body underneath. Now you could use some sandpaper and a round sanding block and just basically sand that out by hand. I'm going to use the Dremel because, well, it's a lot quicker. So let's go out to the other workshop and grind this out with the Dremel. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to use one of these sanding drum pieces on the Dremel, and what I want to do here when I grind this out is actually follow the die cast wheel arch edge on the inside. So I'm using that die cast edge as a guide and letting the Dremel follow that. Now just remember to keep the Dremel nice and square to the width of the body, just to keep that line. Now let's do that. Now the Dremel will actually go through the putty pretty easily. You can keep the body flat, just making sure that you are keeping the Dremel flat as well. And just remember to keep the Dremel following the die cast. So you can see there that the Dremel has actually followed the metal quite easily. You can see the metal is nice and shiny now from where the Dremel has actually cut through it or followed it. And you can see now that you've got a perfect arch shape here from the Dremel. So that's the best way to give you exactly the same wheel arch shape as the standard model, and that is going to be the starting point for the finished shape of the wide arch flare. So we'll go back inside into my other modeling area now that this real messy stuff is out of the way, and we'll move forward on shaping this particular flare. Okay, so now that we're back inside and we've ground out that shape of the wheel arch, next thing I want to do is actually square it up vertically. So squaring it up this way. Now you can see there's a little bit of an irregular shape on the outside, just where the putty went out past the cardboard. The cardboard was the edge that I wanted the wheel arch flare to be. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to square this one up. Now I'm just basically using a sanding block and some 120 grit paper, because this will get the job done very fast. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to sand this way parallel to the body, so that I can square this wheel arch flare up. Now what I do it the right way up so I can look down on it. It's a little bit harder to do this while I'm on camera, while I'm trying to film this, but basically this is what I will do. I'll sit the body on just a roll of masking tape there, just to keep the body off the ground a little bit, and then I can basically use my sanding block here. I can look down the body this way and make sure that it's parallel, and then I can just keep sanding the outside of this putty until I'm happy with the shape. So you can see what I'm doing here. You can see where, oh, hopefully you can see it there, yeah. You can see that where the putty was wider at the bottom, it's actually making that a lot flatter, and the flat is disappearing on the back of the wheel arch. So I want that to stay vertical through here. I'm going to shape the bottom of this here, but I want the main part of the wheel arch to be flat. So I'll just keep sanding that until I am happy with the actual flatness of the wheel arch. And this is basically the starting points for all the shaping that comes after this. Okay, so now you can see there, hopefully, it's a bit hard when the putty's white. Obviously the putty was a lot fatter at the bottom here, so squaring it up here actually removes more of it, which is why this area is so flat. And then as you come around to here, it gets thinner and thinner. It's pretty close to where I want it. I only want a couple of millimeters of flat all the way around the arch, and then I'm going to sand it all the way back. So this is nearly where I want it. I don't want to take too much off, so I'll just come back with the sanding block, sand it a little bit more, and I'm happy with that now. So as you can see there, you can see the flat's a lot wider on here. That does not matter at this stage. And then as you get further around the back, hopefully you can see that because of the color of the putty, it is getting smaller and smaller here, but still a couple of millimeters. So that basically gives me the inside arch shape, and it gives me the vertical flat face, where we see there, yeah, it gives me the vertical flat face of the wide arch flare. So that is the starting point, how to shape it, or this is how I do it anyway. Now what I want to do is, let me just grab my black marker, and what I want to do here is just colour the edge of the putty in black. Now you'll see why I do this in a minute. Being that the putty is such a light colour, it's sometimes hard to see how much you sand off, and by colouring in the edge of the fender here, this is going to make it much easier to keep a flat edge on the edge of the fender flare. Now most wide body flares still have a flat section like a standard fender, so we want to keep that in this particular instance. Now what I'll do again, I'll use quite a heavy sandpaper to start roughing in the shape of this fender, and we can come back with a finer sandpaper later on and take all the scratches out. So again, I'm just using 120 grit sandpaper, and we're going to start shaping the rough shape of this flare. Okay, so what I'm going to do when I sand this, I don't want to sand it right to the lower edge that I've just put coloured in black marker, because then I'll lose that flat. So I'll just keep the sandpaper at a little bit of an angle and start sanding it. It does sand quite easy, this Tamiya putty, so it's not too bad. And this is where all the time comes for shaping these wide body flares. It's all in the sanding, which is yeah, sometimes tedious, but if you want to create some wide body flares, you've got to put the time in and you've got to do all the shaping. Now it's just, I'm not going to try and achieve the final shape of the fender flare here. What I want to do is just get this as smooth as possible all the way around. Well, let me just zoom this in a little bit more for you guys. There we go. So yeah, what I want to do is just keep in mind that I don't want to sand off all that black marker that I left on the side of the fender flare, but just use that as a guide. So as I said, this is the most tedious part. You just have to keep sanding and sanding until you get the shape. Now you can see that's a bit more, it's a bit more parallel now here, but it still gets a lot wider here. So what we want to do is just take a lot more of that bulk off. And yeah, I think we might do a little bit of time lapse here with a lot more sanding. Okay, so now you can see that I've actually smoothed this out a lot more with the 120 grit sandpaper, and I've just left that little bit of an edge. It's a little bit hard to see there, but let me put some more marker on there. Pretty much just got that edge, still leaving a couple of millimeters all the way around it. So as you can see there, I'm using that edge and sanding up to that edge so that I leave a little bit of flat on here. The rest of it from here on in is just more sanding. So we're just going to stop using the 120 grit now and just going to a 180 grit paper, and all the rest of the sanding from this point on will be with the 180 grit. Now you're probably not going to be able to see, maybe you can. The 120 grit does leave some scratching in the putty, but once you start using 180 onwards from here, this is going to smooth it out a lot more. So yeah, anything from there, even just that small little sand there has smoothed a lot of the scratches out. Now the other thing I want to talk about is the edge of the fender flare. So you can use a file for that, just a flat file. Let me find one here. So there we go. There's just a little flat file. You can use that and actually just run that along the edge of the flare just to take any bumps out. If you have any little bumps or you want to reduce the size of that, you can use a little mini file. But what I also do is make my own sanding sticks. So I just use some paddle pop sticks, just stick some sandpaper on there, and then you can actually use that as well. So if you don't have any little mini files, you can actually use your homemade sanding sticks. Now you can also buy pre-made sanding sticks as well. I just make my own. It saves the money, but that is how you can work the outside edge of that fender flare, is just to smooth it out a little bit more, and you'll find that actually the homemade sanding sticks with paddle pop sticks actually work really, really well. So yeah, you can just finesse the outside of the fender flare in that exact way. And again, it's just time. It's just sanding, sanding, sanding. I can't emphasize that enough with these wide body flares. And the other thing you'll notice is the actual thickness of the putty on the top of this fender flare as well. So we'll address that a little bit further. I want to keep working on the shape of this fender flare, and then we'll actually spray some grey Tamiya primer on it just to check the progress, and then we'll fine tune it from there. So at this stage, it's just more sanding with the 180 grit sandpaper to get that shape. Now before we go much further on this one, I want to show you how to do body lines. Now if we get a marker here and a little rule, you'll notice on this Ferrari F430 model that there's a body line running through here above the side skirt. So what I want to do is just run my rule parallel with that line. I'm just going to use a little marker and I'm going to draw that body line on there. So that's the continuation of the body line from here. And for this example, what we're going to do, we're going to scallop this bottom section of the flare out. So again, we're using that body line. We don't want to sand that off. We want that to be the body line where the transition change is. Now this is another little trick. When you want to make something concave like this, you can basically use your finger and sand that out, or you can actually use just a black marker and you can you can roll your sandpaper around that round barrel of the marker, and then you can actually start removing a ton of putty that way. That way you're actually going to sand a round into it. Now I'm going back to the 120 grit here because I've got quite a lot of material I want to remove here. So we'll use this grade sandpaper just to basically remove the bulk of the putty that we want to remove. When it's time to fine tune the actual shape that you're working on, then go back to the 180 grit or 240 grit or finer to finesse the shape. But you can see there how the sandpaper, let me clear some way there, you can see there how some sandpaper just wrapped around a marker gives you a perfectly concave shape. So we're just going to keep working on that one and get the desired shape that we want. Just always keeping an eye on where you draw a panel line, because you don't want to remove that panel line. And actually going to move towards the bottom here and sand more of that material off here as well. You could use something larger diameter marker, or a piece of dowel, or anything that's rounded really, just to start getting that shape. So we're getting there, but it takes a lot of sanding. So you can see here what I want to do, I want to remove more of this bulk through here. Now you can actually use a hobby knife as well if you want to, and cut some of that away. That's just going to save a bit of time. You don't want to remove more than you want to, so just be careful with a hobby knife. Sorry, hard to do that all on camera. And that's just going to make the sanding a lot easier, because it's just less to sand through. So we're just going to keep using that texture there, or black marker wrapped in sandpaper. It might come back this way now as well. Always just keeping an eye on that panel line that you've drawn on there. Sanding, sanding, sanding. Lots of fun. Okay, so you can see a lot of that bulk has been removed now, and we've got this Liberty Walk scallops sort of shape through here. The rest of it now is just a little bit more fine tuning to get this edge up to the body line. So just going to continue to sand that as close as I dare to the bodywork. Okay, so you can see there on the back here, you can see this concave hollowed out shape here. Now I've got the shape basically where I want it. I'm going to go to the finer sandpaper. So now I'm going to go back to the 180 grit sandpaper, so that the rest of the putty removal actually starts getting a lot smoother as well. So just going to go back this way now and just smooth it out and get all those little deeper scratches out of the putty. Now I'll actually go to my finger shortly. I'm just going to remove a little bit more of this putty with the sandpaper wrapped around the black marker, and then I can start fine tuning it with my finger. So you can see there, that is actually really starting to get the shape into it now. Now I just want to work that, remove that extra little bit of putty back to the line that I've drawn on there as well. Now sometimes it's a little bit easier to do that just with the sandpaper and your fingers, so we're just going to do that as well. And you can even roll the sandpaper a little bit like that, just to get that where you want it. So unless you're really copying a particular flare, a Liberty Walk flare, or a Rocket Bunny flare, or just coming up with your own design, it's really up to you how you want to shape it until you think it looks right. There's no real hard and fast rule that says it has to be done this way or it has to be done that way. You know, look at some of the crazy designs you see on the internet, designed by Kaisel Salim. He's got some really crazy wide body designs that he does 3D animations of. Really very cool. So yeah, that is much closer to the body line now. So it's just a matter of just more sanding, keeping an eye on the line so that you don't cut through it. And that really is giving us that Liberty Walk, you can see it better there, that Liberty Walk shape where it scallops in from the bottom of the body line. Now there's actually a little bit of putty lower than the side sill here, so you can go back to your sanding block here and you can flush all that putty back to the side sill as well, as you can see there. So a little bit more finessing to do there. I will do a little bit more sanding on here, but the other thing, if you've got a side scoop like this, you can come back with your hobby knife and you can actually use the hobby knife and cut some of that excess away as well. You can do it with sandpaper as well. You can just slowly sand it out. It's really up to you with your experience level, but just play around. Have a practice making wide body flares on a cheap model. Buy a cheap Maisto or Burago and have a little bit of a play around with that. Yeah, have some fun with the process. It should be fun. Modeling is supposed to be all about fun, and that's what I always try and do. I try and have fun. It's very relaxing for me to build models, and that's why I do it. Okay, so you can see there, I've flushed up the bottom of the putty with the metal. Just use the hobby knife to finesse the shape of that air scoop a little bit. Of course, I'll come back with all the sandpaper and sand all that flush and play around with the edges a little bit just to line it up with the Fender flare above. Might actually just square that off a little bit like that. but it's really just all sanding. That's really very little time in front of the camera here just to show you how to do that much already. So yeah, there's actually another body line on this Ferrari which runs through the top of the fender there. It's the same sort of principle. If you want to mark where that body line is, and then you can draw a line. You can try and get a decent line on there, and then you can actually sand the shape of the top of the fender, so you can actually sand that in on a bit more of an angle to create a bit of a body line. Now probably want to use something that is a bit more flexible to try and just make sure that that body line is straight, and just keep checking it. Use a little steel rule or something like that just to make sure, and just keep sanding away. I can't emphasize that enough, that what your wide body flares will look like is how much time you want to put into them. So yeah, that is basically the process of all the sanding and the shaping. As I've mentioned, I'll just recap. So we want to grind out the inside edge with the Dremel, or you could use a round sanding block and sand that out manually if you wanted to. Next thing was to square up the vertical face of the flare. Third was to just colour in the edge with black marker so that you don't remove too much, so that the black edge is the finished edge. And then it's just a matter of sanding and shaping this flare, and the little tips as well for shaping the outside panel with a little file, or the homemade sanding sticks as well. So I'm just going to do a time lapse again, and just keep sanding away and get this little bit closer. Okay, so after that little bit of sanding, or quite a bit of sanding, however you want to determine that, I've pretty much got the bulk of the shape how I want it. So as you can see, I've finessed these bottom edges a little bit, just keeping an eye on that panel line, and as you can see, I did that same on the back there. So these Liberty Walk rear fenders have a little bit of a scallop on the underside of the back of the flare as well. So I did just use the hobby knife there just to cut away some of that bodywork, and just finessed it a little bit as well to get it a bit smoother. So you can see it's got a nice profile shape to it as well. Now if you want to actually make that more concave, the actual shape of the flare, just sort of keep your finger behind the sandpaper and keep a little bit of a bend on it when you sand it, and that'll create a concave shape to the fender flare. So what I like to do at this point is just apply some Tamiya grey primer over it. As I said, with the white putty, it is quite hard sometimes to see the thickness of the edges because it is white. So I find that if I spray some grey primer on there, I'll actually be able to see where the irregularities are in the flare. So I'm just going to go outside and spray some grey primer on that, and then I will be back. Okay, so I've just sprayed some grey primer on that. So all I'm using is just the Tamiya grey surface primer. Most of that will get sanded off, but it's just basically so that I can now see the edges. So you can automatically see that on camera. Now that it's actually grey, you can see the thickness of the edge of the flare, and you just get a better overall idea of the shape of the fender that you've just created. Now from here on, it's just fine tuning. So you can see on this particular fender flare, the edge is a little bit thicker through here, through this middle section than it is at the back. So then I'll just basically simply go back and sand more of the fender flare through the middle. Now the beauty with leaving the primer on there is that the primer will stay on that flat edge. You're not actually going to sand that away, but once you start sanding, the white appears from underneath, and you can actually sand and get that edge parallel. So that's pretty much all the steps I do from here on, is just fine tuning with some more sandpaper, and every now and again just a coat of grey primer on there. That will just show up what shape you've created and what areas need a little bit more work. But that's going to wrap up part 2 of this how to build wide body flare tutorial. This is just a spare body that, well, it's an offcut of a body really, that's not going to be used for anything. So I really don't want to spend much more time on this exercise, but this is enough, I feel, to show you how I make my wide body flares and the process now of how to shape these wide body flares as well. So as I say, have some fun with it. There's no real hard and fast rule that says what a flare shape has to be. Just use your imagination, or as I say, if you're copying a Liberty Walk flare or something, just research, have a look at tons of pics on the internet, and just have a play around with the shape that you're going to create. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial series on how to make wide body flares. If you're new to the channel, why not subscribe? Don't forget to smash that like button for this tutorial if it's helped you out, and stay tuned, plenty more videos on the way. So until next time, thanks for watching Rob's Model Cars.